After losing his business, his future, and the woman he loved most, James Carter believed there was nothing left to save. The company he had spent years building was gone. The dreams he had sacrificed for were gone. And the marriage he thought would last forever had slipped through his fingers. Yet, what hurt the most was not the failure. It was the silence that followed. A year later, the woman who walked away would return, standing in the rain, carrying words he never expected to hear. But before that moment could happen, both of them would have to face the consequences of the choices they had made. What would you do if you lost everything you worked for in a single year? Would you stay and fight, or would you walk away? Tell us in the comments. The rain had not stopped for 3 days in Seattle. It was not the soft, comforting rain people imagine when they think about quiet evenings and warm memories. It was cold, heavy, relentless. The kind of rain that seemed determined to wash color from the world. But what made those days unbearable was not the weather. It was what the weather revealed. Because life rarely falls apart all at once. Most of the time, it happens slowly. Quietly. One disappointment at a time. One missed conversation at a time. One unspoken fear at a time. Until eventually, two people who once shared everything find themselves living like strangers beneath the same roof. Inside a nearly empty apartment on the 12th floor of an aging residential building, James Carter sat alone on a worn couch. The room was silent. Yet, it did not feel empty. The silence was crowded with memories. Crowded with regrets. Crowded with questions that had no answers. On the coffee table rested a stack of unpaid bills. Beside them sat a cold cup of coffee. Near the edge of the table was a wedding photograph turned face down. James had not touched it in months. Every time he looked at that picture, he saw someone he no longer recognized. A man who believed hard work could solve every problem. A man who believed love could survive anything. A man who looked at the future with certainty. That man felt like a stranger now. He remembered the early mornings, waking up at 4 o'clock, driving to an office that smelled of fresh paint and ambition. He remembered the late-night whiteboard sessions with his team, drinking lukewarm energy drinks, mapping out a future where they would change the industry. Back then, every obstacle was just a puzzle waiting to be solved. Back then, he had the energy of a man who thought failure was a choice, not an inevitability. He had poured his life savings into the company, followed by their shared investments, and finally, loans that required him to pledge everything they owned. Emily had trusted him. She had signed the papers alongside him, looking into his eyes and telling him that she believed in his vision. But belief, much like money, has a breaking point. And when the bank accounts began to empty, the trust began to fray. The apartment felt different without Emily. The rooms felt larger. The walls felt colder. The air itself felt heavier. Every corner reminded him of what had been lost. The kitchen where she used to sing while cooking dinner. The sofa where they spent countless evenings watching movies. The balcony where they dreamed about the future. Every memory felt alive. And sometimes, memories can hurt more than reality. James remembered the first day they met. It was a Tuesday, a crowded coffee shop near the university. She had spilled her drink on his notebook, and instead of getting angry, he had laughed, charmed by her wide, embarrassed smile. He remembered her laughter. The way it could clear the tension from any room. He remembered their first apartment, a tiny studio space where the radiator hissed all winter and the stove only had 2 working burners. They were broke, but they were happy. They had road trips where the car broke down in the middle of Oregon, and they spent the night counting stars through the rusted sunroof. Their wedding day was simple, a small backyard gathering surrounded by people who loved them. The promises they made were solemn, spoken with the absolute conviction of youth. The future they planned was full of travel, children, and a quiet house by the water. Back then, everything seemed possible. Back then, they believed love was enough. But somewhere along the way, things changed. The distance did not appear overnight. It arrived quietly. Emily stopped sharing stories about her day. She stopped sitting beside him during dinner. She stopped laughing as often. At first, James ignored the signs. Everyone goes through difficult seasons. Every marriage faces challenges. Things would improve. At least, that was what he told himself. Have you ever noticed a relationship drifting apart but chosen to ignore it? Share your story below. But reality was moving in another direction. His startup had become his entire world. For 3 years, he worked longer hours than he ever thought possible. He sacrificed weekends. He sacrificed sleep. He sacrificed peace of mind. He poured everything into building something meaningful. He thought he was doing it for them. He thought that if he could just build this empire, if he could secure their financial freedom, they would finally be safe. But in the process of building a shield to protect them, he had forgotten to look at the person standing right next to him. Then, everything collapsed. It happened during a single week in October. A major competitor launched a similar platform, backed by millions in venture capital. Within 48 hours, 3 of James's largest clients canceled their contracts. Then, the primary investors pulled out, citing market instability and a lack of confidence in the current leadership. Clients disappeared. Partnerships ended. Debt continued growing. Every month brought new problems. Every week delivered new disappointments. He tried to hide the numbers from Emily, hiding the foreclosure notices in his briefcase, pretending everything was fine when he came home at midnight. But she could smell the desperation on him. The pressure followed him home. The stress followed him home. The fear followed him home. And eventually, those burdens found their way into the marriage. James was trying his best. He truly was. But sometimes, trying and succeeding are not the same thing. Sometimes, effort is invisible. Sometimes, love alone cannot overcome exhaustion. One morning, he walked into the living room and froze. Emily stood near the front door. A suitcase rested beside her. For a brief moment, his mind refused to understand what he was seeing. The morning light was pale, casting long, gray shadows across the hardwood floor. Then, reality arrived. Everything inside him tightened. The expression on her face told him more than words ever could. She looked exhausted. Not angry. Not hateful. Just tired. And somehow, that hurt even more. Because anger still fights. Anger means there is still energy left to argue, still a desire to change the outcome. Exhaustion gives up. She had reached a place where hope no longer felt possible. James felt panic rising inside him. He tried to find the right words. The right promise. The right solution. He wanted to tell her about the new meeting he had scheduled for next week. The potential consultant who claimed they could restructure the debt. But some moments arrive after all the opportunities have already passed. The silence between them carried years of disappointment. Years of fear. Years of pressure. Years of expectations that neither of them knew how to carry anymore. He wanted to stop her. He wanted to tell her everything would get better. He wanted to convince her to stay. But confidence is difficult to fake when your own life is falling apart. For a brief second, she hesitated. Her hand lingered on the handle of her suitcase, her eyes tracing the lines of his face, looking for the man she had married. For a brief second, hope returned. Then, it disappeared. Moments later, she walked through the door. The door closed softly behind her. No shouting. No dramatic scene. No final argument. Just silence. The kind of silence that changes a life forever. If this emotional journey is touching your heart, please take a moment to like this video. It truly helps us share these stories with more people who might need them today. The days that followed felt unreal. Time lost meaning. Morning became afternoon. Afternoon became night. Night became another sleepless morning. James barely ate. He spent hours walking through the empty rooms, listening to the floorboards creak beneath his weight. He barely slept, waking up in the middle of the night reaching for someone who was no longer there. He barely spoke, his voice becoming raspy from disuse. The bankruptcy process was cold and mechanical. Lawyers sat across tables from him, sliding papers back and forth, explaining that his assets would be liquidated. His office furniture, his computers, the very intellectual property he had spent years developing, everything was sold for pennies on the dollar. Friends called. They offered condolences, they offered to take him out for drinks, they offered their empty phrases of comfort. He ignored them. Family members reached out. They left voicemails filled with worry, asking if he needed a place to stay, if he needed money for groceries. He ignored them too. Nothing seemed important anymore. The world outside continued moving. People went to work. People laughed. People made plans. Meanwhile, James remained trapped inside a life he no longer recognized. Some days, he sat for hours staring through the window. Watching rain slide down the glass. Watching strangers hurry through the streets below, each of them carrying their own hidden tragedies. Wondering how everything had gone so wrong. The loneliness became overwhelming. Not because he was physically alone. Because he felt abandoned by the future he once believed in. Every dream seemed broken. Every goal seemed meaningless. Every memory felt painful. Weeks passed. Then months. The apartment remained quiet. The pain remained constant. Yet, even in the darkest seasons, something inside people refuses to disappear completely. A small spark. A tiny voice. A stubborn belief that tomorrow might be different. If you are finding strength in this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. We share powerful narratives of love, loss, and redemption every single week. One evening, there was a knock at the door. William Harris stood outside. William had been James's closest friend since their university days. He was a tall man, with kind eyes and a direct manner that didn't allow for self-pity. The moment he stepped inside, he looked around the apartment and understood the situation immediately. The unwashed dishes in the sink, the layers of dust on the bookshelves, the dark circles beneath James's eyes. The exhaustion on James's face said everything. The silence said everything. The loneliness said everything. For a long time, neither man spoke. William walked to the kitchen, filled a glass with water, and set it in front of James. Finally, William looked directly at him. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't say everything happens for a reason. He told him that losing a company was painful. Losing a marriage was even harder. But staying trapped in that darkness would eventually cost him something even more important. It would cost him himself. "You are not your business, James," William said quietly. "And you are not defined by the fact that she walked away. You are defined by what you do next." Those words lingered long after William left. They bounced off the empty walls, echoing in the quiet corners of his mind. At first, nothing changed. The next morning was just as heavy as the one before. Then, something small happened. James got out of bed earlier, before the sun had fully risen. He made the bed, stretching the sheets tight, forcing order onto a small corner of his world. The next day, he answered an email, an inquiry from a local firm looking for someone with his technical expertise. A few days later, he went outside for a walk. It was the first time he had felt the cold wind on his face in months. Small victories. Tiny improvements. Steps so small that nobody else would notice them. But progress rarely arrives in dramatic ways. Most of the time, it begins with small decisions repeated consistently. Weeks became months. Months became nearly a year. And slowly, James rebuilt his life. Not the life he had before. A different one. A stronger one. He accepted consulting work, helping smaller businesses identify inefficiencies in their systems. He found comfort in the objective nature of the work. Problems had solutions. Code could be fixed. Data didn't have feelings. Then he took on more consulting work, his reputation for honesty and precision growing within the local community. He created routines. He woke up at 6 o'clock every morning, ran 3 miles through the park, and spent an hour reading before starting his workday. He exercised regularly, his body becoming leaner, his mind clearer. He learned how to manage his finances with absolute transparency, tracking every dollar, ensuring he would never find himself at the mercy of a bank again. He stopped defining himself by his failures. He began to see the collapse of his business not as a death sentence, but as an expensive education. Most importantly, he stopped waiting for the past to return. He stopped looking at the doorway, expecting Emily to walk through it. Instead, he focused on creating a future. The transformation was gradual. Many people would not have noticed it. They would have just seen a man going to work, buying groceries, living a quiet life. But William noticed. One evening, he visited again, bringing over a couple of steaks to cook on the small balcony grill. The moment James opened the door, William smiled. For the first time in a very long time, James looked alive. His shoulders were back, his posture straight, his eyes focused on the present moment. Not because his problems had disappeared. Not because life had become easy. Because he had become stronger. Pain had not destroyed him. It had changed him. And there is a difference. Around the same time, Emily was trying to rebuild her own life. She had moved across the city, into a small, one-bedroom apartment that smelled of old wood and lavender. She found a job as a graphic designer for a boutique marketing agency. She poured her energy into her art, creating clean, beautiful designs for clients who never knew the history behind the woman holding the stylus. She posted smiling photographs online, pictures of her at local art galleries, hiking in the mountains, drinking wine with coworkers. Friends assumed she was happy. They left comments telling her how brave she was, how wonderful it was to see her thriving after such a difficult separation. But appearances can be deceiving. Social media is a gallery of highlights, not a record of the quiet hours. Every evening, when the apartment grew quiet and the computer screen went dark, the doubts returned. She would sit on her small bed, listening to the distant hum of traffic, and she would look at her hands. She questioned the decision she had made. She wondered whether she had confused hardship with failure. She wondered whether she had abandoned someone during the moment he needed support the most. She remembered the nights James had come home. His skin pale with exhaustion, his hands trembling as he tried to log into his bank accounts. She had thought he was shutting her out. But now, with the distance of time, she wondered if he was just trying to protect her from the blast radius of his collapse. She tried not to think about James. But memories have a way of finding people. The more she pushed them away, the stronger they became. She remembered their first date, the way he had listened to her talk about her art with absolute fascination. She remembered road trips, the sound of his voice singing along to old songs on the radio. She remembered laughter. She remembered dreams. She remembered promises. And with every memory came another question. What if she had stayed? What if they had fought harder against the debt and the stress? Instead of letting those things push them into separate corners, What if fear had made the decision instead of love? Those questions followed her everywhere, into her meetings, into her art, into her sleep. A year passed. Then another season. The doubts never completely disappeared. If you enjoy these deep explorations of the human heart, make sure to subscribe to Second Chance Love so you never miss a chapter of healing and hope. Then, one rainy Thursday evening, she found herself standing outside James's building. She had not planned the visit. At least, that was what she told herself as she got into her car and drove across the bridge. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was regret. Maybe it was love. Perhaps it was all three. The rain fell steadily as she waited near the entrance, the drops hitting her umbrella with a rhythmic, heavy sound. Her heart raced, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Part of her wanted to leave, to turn around, get back in her car, and pretend she had never come. Part of her wanted to knock on the door, to see his face, to know if he was okay. Part of her feared she was too late. Feared that he had moved on, found someone else, or grown to hate her. Then, she saw him. James had just returned from work, walking down the sidewalk with his collar turned up against the wind. He wasn't running from the rain. He was walking with a steady, deliberate pace. For a moment, neither moved. They stood 10 feet apart, the city moving around them like a blur. The years between them seemed to disappear. The memories returned instantly. The pain returned instantly. The love returned instantly. Everything felt familiar. Everything felt different. They stood there in silence. The kind of silence that carries 1,000 conversations. The kind of silence that contains years of unfinished thoughts. James looked at her, his face calm, but his eyes reflecting a deep, sudden shock. "Emily," he said, his voice barely louder than the rain. "Hi, James," she replied, her voice trembling. Eventually, Emily gathered enough courage to speak. They went to a small, quiet diner down the street, sitting in a corner booth away from the windows. She admitted she had made a mistake. The words left her mouth with surprising ease. Perhaps because she had rehearsed them hundreds of times in the quiet of her bedroom. Perhaps because they had lived inside her heart for so long. James listened carefully, his hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea. There had been a time when he imagined this moment differently. During those first dark months, he had imagined anger. He had imagined telling her how much her departure had broken him. How unfair it was that she left when the storm was at its worst. He had imagined accusations. He imagined questions. But standing there now, looking at her face, none of those things mattered. Time had changed him. Pain had changed him. Growth had changed him. He understood things differently now. He understood that she hadn't left because she stopped loving him. She left because she didn't have the strength to watch him drown, and he was too proud to ask for help. Emily confessed that leaving had not brought peace. It had not solved her problems. It had only replaced one kind of pain with another. She admitted she had been afraid. Afraid of uncertainty. Afraid of failure. Afraid of watching everything collapse into nothing. James understood. Because he had been afraid too. He had been terrified of being a failure in her eyes, and that terror had made him distant, defensive, and cold. For the first time in years. They spoke honestly. No excuses. No pretending. No hiding. Just truth. And sometimes, truth is the beginning of healing. Over the following weeks, James and Emily began talking again. Slowly. Carefully. They didn't jump back into a relationship. They didn't try to move back into the same space. There were no promises. No guarantees. No expectations. Only honesty. They would meet on weekends, taking long walks through the botanical gardens or sitting in quiet libraries. They discussed everything they had avoided discussing before. Their fears. Their disappointments. Their mistakes. Their regrets. The conversations were not easy. Some nights ended with tears, as they dragged up old wounds that had never properly closed. Some nights ended with silence, as they processed the weight of what they had done to each other. Some nights ended with difficult truths. But every conversation brought them one step closer to understanding. One evening, as they sat in a small Italian restaurant, Emily asked whether people truly change. James thought about the question for a long time, watching the candle flame flicker between them. Then, he realized something important. Perhaps people do not change as much as they reveal themselves. Difficult seasons expose strengths. Difficult seasons expose weaknesses. Difficult seasons expose truths. The challenges they faced had revealed parts of themselves they never knew existed. The experience had humbled them. It had forced them to grow. It had taught them lessons success never could. "I don't think I'm a different man, Emily," James said softly. "I think I'm just the man I was always supposed to be, but I had to lose everything to find him." Months passed. The conversations continued. Trust slowly returned. Not overnight. Not magically. It returned in the way he answered her calls, without hesitation. It returned in the way she listened to him talk about his new business ventures, without fear in her eyes. One small step at a time. The same way healing happens. The same way growth happens. The same way love survives. Eventually, they found themselves standing together on a balcony overlooking the city. It was the same balcony where they had once argued, where they had once looked out at the lights and felt the crushing weight of their debts. The skyline looked familiar. The rain felt familiar. The memories felt familiar. Yet, everything was different. Because they were different. They had survived loss. They had survived regret. They had survived disappointment. Most importantly, they had survived themselves. Neither of them was the same person anymore. And perhaps, that was the reason they finally had a chance. They had stripped away the vanity. The pride, the false expectations. They were just two people, damaged but whole, standing in the present. Their second chance was not perfect. It was not effortless. It was not a fairy tale. It was real. Real love requires honesty. Real love requires courage. Real love requires growth. Sometimes, relationships break. Sometimes, people leave. Sometimes, hearts shatter. Sometimes, dreams collapse. But sometimes, people learn. Sometimes, people grow. Sometimes, people return. And when they return wiser, stronger, and more honest than before, something remarkable can happen. Not perfection. Not magic. Something better. Something real. Because real love is not about never falling apart. Real love is about finding the courage to rebuild when everything falls apart. James and Emily learned that lesson the hard way. Through loss. Through regret. Through loneliness. Through growth. Their story was not about avoiding pain. It was about surviving it. It was about discovering that failure is not always the end. Sometimes, failure becomes the beginning of something stronger. Their journey proved that people are capable of change. Capable of forgiveness. Capable of growth. Capable of second chances. And perhaps, that is why their story matters. Because every person listening carries their own regrets. Their own mistakes. Their own unfinished chapters. Their own hopes for redemption. Life does not always go according to plan. Dreams fail. Relationships struggle. People make mistakes. Yet, none of those things automatically define the ending. Sometimes, the chapter that feels like the end becomes the beginning of something far more meaningful. Sometimes, the most important growth happens after heartbreak. Sometimes, the greatest strength appears after failure. Sometimes, the deepest love emerges after loss. And sometimes, the second chance becomes more valuable than the first. That is what James and Emily discovered. Not because life became easy. Not because pain disappeared. But because they learned how to face the truth together. And in that truth, they found something worth fighting for. Every ending carries the possibility of a new beginning. Every loss carries a lesson. Every setback carries an opportunity. And every broken heart carries the possibility of healing. The story is not over. Not for James. Not for Emily. And not for you. If you believe that everyone deserves a second chance to fix their mistakes, please subscribe, hit the like button, and share your perspective with us in the comments below. When everything you built has turned to dust, and the ground beneath you has completely shattered, do you have the true courage to look into the eyes of the person who walked away? And ask yourself, is love enough to rebuild from the ashes?